The stars outside the viewport weren't beautiful anymore. They were just cold, distant points of light, witnesses to too much death. Inside the command deck of the Aegis, the air smelled of burnt wiring, stale sweat, and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe, or rust, or both. The ship groaned softly with every minor course correction, like an old man shifting in his sleep after a lifetime of hard labor. This wasn't a proud fleet arriving in glory. It was the last of what remained. 3 frigates, their hulls patched with scavenged plating from dead ships, a battered refugee transport crammed with 12,000 souls, mostly women, children, and the elderly, who had watched their homes burn from orbit. And the Aegis, once the pride of Earth's defense line, now little more than a floating fortress held together by hope and emergency sealant. They'd fought a war nobody asked for. The enemy wasn't human. It didn't negotiate. It didn't surrender. It just consumed. Planets, ships, people, like a wildfire through dry grass. Billions were gone. Entire star systems reduced to silence. And somehow, against every odd, humanity had pushed back. Not with fancy weapons or secret tech, but with sheer stubborn refusal to vanish now. After years of running, hiding, and fighting, they'd reached the one place they hoped might offer a chance, Concordia Prime, the neutral meeting ground of the Galactic Council. Rumor said dozens of alien species gathered there, some ancient, some wise, some ruthless. None had ever seen humans before, and none had lifted a finger to help during the war. As the fleet drifted into the Council's outer perimeter, sensors lit up with contacts. Dozens of alien vessels, sleek, strange, some shaped like spirals, others like jagged obsidian shards, hovered in perfect formation. No weapons fired, no warnings blared, just silence, watching. On the bridge, the crew held their breath. They weren't soldiers anymore. Not really. They were survivors. Some had lost families. Others had lost entire worlds. One young comms officer kept glancing at a cracked photo taped to her console. A little boy with messy hair, smiling in front of a blue sky that no longer existed. Admiral Voss stood at the front, arms crossed, eyes fixed on the massive ring-shaped station ahead. She hadn't slept in 2 days. Her uniform was stained, her boots scuffed, her voice hoarse from giving orders in the dark. But she stood straight, not out of pride, out of responsibility. 12,000 lives depended on what happened next. "Broadcast the signal," she said quietly. A technician tapped a few keys. Across every known galactic frequency, a simple message began repeating, in 17 languages, painstakingly learned from old alien broadcasts intercepted during the war. "We come in peace. We have survived. We ask only to be heard. No threats, no demands, just truth." Outside, the human ships told their own story. Their hulls were blackened from plasma burns. Jagged scars ran along the sides where enemy claws had torn through metal. Dried, dark residue, part organic, part alien, clung to the lower decks. It wasn't paint. It was the remains of the things they'd killed to stay alive. The blood on their ships wasn't theirs. It was the enemy's, and it was everywhere. Some of the alien ships shifted position. A few moved closer, scanning beams flickering over the human fleet like curious fingers. Others stayed back, engines idling, unreadable. Inside the refugee transport, a child pressed her face against the reinforced window. "Are they going to help us?" she whispered to her grandmother. The old woman didn't answer right away. She just held the girl's hand tighter. "I don't know, my love, but we made it this far. That has to mean something." Back on the Aegis, the Admiral watched the station grow larger. She remembered Earth, not the ruined husk it was now, but how it used to be. Oceans glittering under sunlight, cities humming with life, laughter in crowded streets. All of that was gone, but not the people. Not yet. She turned to her crew. "No matter what happens in there," she said, "we don't beg. We don't lie. We show them who we are, not as warriors, but as humans, tired, broken maybe, but still standing." A quiet murmur of agreement passed through the bridge. No cheers, no speeches, just nods. They'd seen too much for grand words. As the fleet crossed the final checkpoint, a soft chime sounded. A voice, calm, genderless, translated through the ship's system, spoke in clear, simple English. "Human vessels. You are cleared for approach to Docking Bay 7. Prepare for boarding inspection. Do not activate weapons systems." Relief washed over the room, but it was cautious. They knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a different kind of battle. One fought not with lasers and missiles but with words, dignity, and the fragile hope that somewhere in this vast, indifferent universe, there might be room for one more species trying to survive. The Aegis eased forward, its engines humming low. Behind it, the frigates and the refugee ship followed like ducklings. They moved slowly, carefully, like someone walking into a room full of strangers after a long, hard journey, unsure if they'll be welcomed or turned away. But they came anyway, because after everything, the fire, the silence, the endless dark, they still believed in the possibility of kindness. And that, more than any weapon, was what brought them here. As the docking clamps latched onto the Aegis with a soft thud, the lights inside the station flickered to life, warm, steady, almost gentle. Somewhere beyond those walls, beings who had never seen a human face would soon decide their fate. But for now, in this quiet moment between war and peace, the only sound was the soft breathing of 12,000 people holding on to hope, and the distant echo of a ship that had carried them through hell, finally coming to rest. The air inside the council chamber felt heavy, not because it was thick, but because it was full of judgment. Tall curved walls shimmered with soft light, shifting colors like the surface of a calm sea. Strange symbols pulsed gently along the floor, and the seats weren't chairs but smooth floating platforms that rose and dipped as their occupants moved. Everything was clean, perfect, silent. And then there were the humans. They stood in the center of it all, 3 of them, wearing patched uniforms that had seen too many battles. Their boots left faint scuff marks on the polished floor. One of them, the Admiral, kept her hands clasped behind her back, not out of formality but to stop them from shaking. The second was a young linguist, barely out of training, eyes wide behind cracked glasses, clutching a datapad like it was a lifeline. The third was just a kid, 14 maybe, thin as a wire, wrapped in a too big coat someone had given her on the transport. She didn't speak. She just stared at the floor, arms crossed like she was holding herself together. Around them, representatives from 23 different species watched. Some had too many eyes. Others had no eyes at all. A few didn't even have faces, just shifting clouds of light or smooth, featureless masks. None of them moved. None made a sound. But the silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. A voice finally broke it, deep calm, translated through hidden speakers. You come uninvited, unannounced. Your species has never been recognized by this council. Explain why you should not be turned away. The Admiral didn't flinch. She'd expected this. We didn't come for recognition, she said, her voice rough but steady. We came because we had nowhere else to go. A ripple passed through the chamber. One of the taller beings, a creature with skin like polished stone, leaned forward slightly. Your war was your own making. You provoked the swarm, you expanded too fast. You ignored warnings. That's not true, the linguist blurted out, then flinched as if surprised she'd spoken. She swallowed hard, then continued, softer this time. We didn't know what the swarm was. Not at first. We thought they were just another species. We tried to communicate. We sent peaceful signals. They answered with fire. She tapped her datapad. The wall behind them flickered to life. Suddenly, the perfect chamber was filled with raw, unfiltered footage from the war. A school on a colony world. Half collapsed, children huddled under desks as the sky turned red. A medic in a torn uniform, using a piece of broken glass to cut away a soldier's infected leg because the painkillers ran out weeks ago. A father whispering a lullaby into a comms device, knowing his daughter was light years away and might never hear it, but sending it anyway. Then, something unexpected. Humans dragging wounded alien prisoners, captured from slave camps run by the swarm, into their own shelters. Sharing food, giving them oxygen masks. One clip showed a human pilot ejecting from a burning ship, only to steer his escape pod toward a drifting alien lifeboat instead of safety. The chamber stayed silent. But the stillness had changed. It wasn't cold anymore, it was thoughtful. The Admiral spoke again. We didn't start this war, but we finished it. Not because we wanted to be heroes, because if we didn't, no one would be left to remember what we were, what we tried to be. She paused, then added, We're not asking for a seat at your table. We're just asking not to be forgotten. The kid in the big coat finally looked up, not at the council, at the Admiral. Her eyes were dry, but her jaw was tight, like she was fighting back a storm inside. One of the beings, a soft, glowing figure with long, flowing limbs, spoke next. Its voice sounded like wind through trees. Why bring a child? The Admiral glanced at the girl. Because she's what's left. She watched her whole settlement burn. She survived by hiding in a water tank for 3 days while the swarm tore through the streets above. She hasn't spoken in weeks, but she came with us because she wanted to see if the universe still had a place for people like her. The glowing being was quiet for a long moment. Then it said, "Show us the end of your war." The linguist hesitated, then pulled up one last clip. It was shaky, recorded from a helmet cam. A final battle. Humans outnumbered 10 to 1. Ships exploding. Screams over comms. And then a moment of quiet. A soldier, bleeding from the head, dragging a wounded comrade into a bunker. Outside, the swarm screeched. Inside, the soldier shared his last protein bar, split it in half and said, "Eat. You've got family waiting." The feed cut to black. No one in the chamber moved. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Then, from the back, a low, grumbling voice. "You fight like animals." The Admiral turned slowly. "Maybe, but animals protect their young. They defend their home. They don't kill for sport. If that's what you mean, then yes, we fight like animals." A murmur spread through the room. Not angry, not approving, just surprised. The stone-skinned being leaned back. "You expect us to believe you came all this way just to show us your pain?" "No," the Admiral said. "We came because pain is all we have left to offer. We have no riches, no untouched worlds, no armies. Just this." She gestured to the girl beside her. "And the truth." The child finally spoke. One word, quiet but clear. "Please." It wasn't a plea. It was a question. Is there still kindness out there? That single word hung in the air longer than any speech. After a long pause, the glowing being rose. "The council will deliberate. You will wait in the outer chamber. Do not speak to anyone. Do not leave the designated area." As they turned to go, the linguist stumbled slightly. One of the floating platforms shifted just a little and steadied her without touching her. A small thing, but it felt like the first crack in a very thick wall. Outside, in the quiet hallway, the girl finally let out a breath she'd been holding for weeks. She looked up at the ceiling, at the strange, gentle lights, and whispered, "Do you think they saw us?" The Admiral put a hand on her shoulder. "They saw more than we wanted them to. But maybe that's what they needed." Back inside the chamber, the beings didn't argue right away. They just sat in silence, watching the footage loop again, this time without sound. They saw the shared food, the lullaby, the split protein bar, the child in the water tank. For the first time, they weren't looking at a species. They were looking at people, and people, no matter where they came from, carried the same things inside: fear, love, loss, and the quiet hope that someone, somewhere, might care. The humans had arrived with blood on their ships, but in that chamber they left something else behind, something harder to see but far more powerful: their humanity. And for the first time in centuries, the Galactic Council wasn't sure what to do with it. While the humans waited in the quiet outer chamber, the real battle was happening behind closed doors. Inside meeting rooms lined with shifting walls and floating screens, where voices rose and fell like tides. The Council wasn't one mind. It never had been. And now, humanity had thrown a stone into its still waters, sending ripples in every direction. Some saw the humans as dangerous, too emotional, too unpredictable. One delegate, a tall being with smooth silver skin and eyes like black glass, argued that letting humans join would be like inviting a storm into a library. "They burn hot," it said. "They act before they think. They've already broken galactic neutrality by fighting a war that spilled into neutral zones. What's to stop them from doing it again?" Others weren't so sure. A group of beings from the Luminary Conquered, soft-spoken, gentle creatures who communicated more through light pulses than words, had watched the footage over and over. They'd seen the child in the water tank. They'd seen the soldier sharing his last meal, and it reminded them of their own past. Centuries ago, their world had nearly been wiped out by a solar flare. They'd begged for help too, and been ignored. Now, they couldn't look away. But the most dangerous voice came from the Vraxian hegemony, a powerful alliance known for swallowing weaker species into their protection. Their representative didn't shout, didn't gesture, just spoke in a calm, smooth tone that made your skin crawl. Humanity is wounded, it said, but wounds can be useful. Offer them shelter in exchange for service. Let them guard our borders, fight our skirmishes. In time, they'll become part of us, and the galaxy will be safer for it. It sounded generous, but everyone knew what it really meant. Slavery with a nicer name. Meanwhile, back in the waiting area, the humans had no idea what was being said about them. The girl sat curled on a low bench, tracing patterns on the floor with her finger. The linguist paced slowly, chewing her lip, replaying every word she'd said in the chamber, wondering if she'd made things worse. The admiral stood by the window, watching alien ships glide past like silent birds. She knew they were being watched, not just by the council, but by spies, traitors, opportunists. Everyone wanted to know, what would happen to these strange, broken newcomers? What no one knew was that the admiral had brought more than just stories. Hidden in a sealed compartment inside her boot was a small data chip. On it, everything humanity had learned about the swarm, their hive signals, their weak points, the way their biology unraveled under certain frequencies. Knowledge bought with billions of lives, knowledge that could save others from suffering the same fate. That night, when a quiet luminary aide offered them water and soft bread, the admiral made a choice. She slipped the chip into the aide's palm, whispering, "This isn't a weapon. It's a warning." And a gift. The aide didn't speak, just nodded once, eyes glowing faintly brighter, and disappeared down the hall. Within hours, fragments of that data began appearing on private channels. Not all of it, just enough. A frequency that disrupted swarm coordination, a chemical compound that dissolved their exoskeletons. Small pieces shared quietly with key delegates who'd shown even a flicker of sympathy. It wasn't blackmail. It wasn't a threat. It was trust. And in a place built on treaties and suspicion, trust was the rarest currency of all. The next morning, the mood in the council corridors had shifted. Whispers followed the humans as they walked to their waiting room. Some being stepped aside respectfully, others stared openly, not with fear but curiosity. One young delegate from a water-dwelling species even mimicked the human gesture of a nod, a clumsy, earnest attempt at connection. Back in session, the silver-skinned delegate tried again to paint humanity as reckless. But this time, the Luminari spoke up. Reckless is starting wars for power. Their light pulsed gently. What they did was survive. There's a difference. Even the stone-faced Zenthar collective, known for their cold logic, had questions. If their data is accurate, one intoned, it could prevent future conflicts. Efficiency favors preservation over destruction. Perhaps their survival has value. The Vraxian representative stayed silent, but its posture had stiffened. It knew the game was changing. Outside, the girl finally spoke to the linguist. "Do you think they'll let us stay?" The linguist didn't give a false promise. "I don't know, but I think they're starting to see us. Not just our ships, not just our war, us." That afternoon, something small but powerful happened. A maintenance drone, usually programmed to ignore organic beings, paused near the girl. It extended a tiny arm and offered her a smooth, warm stone it had polished from debris. She took it, surprised. The drone beeped softly and rolled away. It wasn't much, but in a place where every action had meaning, it was everything. The Admiral watched it happen and felt something loosen in her chest. Maybe they wouldn't be turned away. Maybe they wouldn't be used. Maybe, just maybe, they'd be seen as equals. But she also knew the hardest part was still ahead. The council hadn't decided, and in the silence between votes, hope could be the heaviest weight of all. Still, as the artificial sun of Concordia Prime dipped behind the station's outer ring, casting long shadows through the hallways, the three humans sat together, not as soldiers, not as refugees, but as people who had carried their world in their hearts all the way across the stars. And somewhere in the quiet hum of the station, the data chip was doing its work, not as a weapon, but as a bridge. Because sometimes the best way to prove you belong is to give something away when you have nothing left to lose. The peace didn't last long. It was late in the station's artificial night cycle, when the lights dimmed, the crowds thinned, and even the busiest delegates retreated to their quarters. The humans had just been given a small room to rest in, barely bigger than a storage closet, but it had real beds and clean water. For the first time in years, the girl actually lay down without flinching at every sound. Then the alarms hit. Not the soft chimes of protocol breaches or system warnings, but the deep, gut-shaking wail of full emergency. Red lights flashed. Gravity shifted slightly, then stabilized. Outside the window, ships scrambled. Docking arms retracted. And through the chaos, a new sound cut through. A high-pitched, chittering screech that made the blood freeze. The swarm wasn't gone. A remnant, small, desperate, maybe even rogue, had followed the human fleet. Or maybe it had been hiding in the station's blind spots all along. Either way, it was here now. And it was hungry. Panic spread fast. Council security forces rushed to the lower docks, but they weren't ready. They'd never faced the swarm before. Their weapons barely scratched the thick, chitinous shells. Their tactics were clean, precise, useless against an enemy that didn't care about pain, didn't fear death, and moved like a single, many-legged nightmare. Within minutes, entire sections of the station were sealed off. Civilians screamed. Alarms blared in a dozen languages. And in the middle of it all, the human ships, still docked, still powered down, sat like sleeping giants. Back in their room, the Admiral was already moving. No hesitation, no orders from above. She just looked at the linguist and the girl and said, "Stay here. Lock the door. Don't open it for anyone but me." Then she ran. She didn't go to the council chamber. She didn't wait for permission. She sprinted through smoke-filled corridors toward the nearest comms hub, shouting into her wrist unit as she went. "All human vessels, power up. Now swarm breach in Sector G7. I repeat, swarm breach." On the Aegis, tired crews who'd just lain down jerked awake. Engineers who'd been patching leaks dropped their tools. Pilots who hadn't slept in days pulled themselves into cockpits with hands that shook, but didn't fail, because they knew that sound. That screech, it haunted their dreams. Within 3 minutes, the human fleet was alive again. Not at full strength, far from it, but enough. The Aegis tore free from its docking clamps with a groan of protesting metal. The frigate spun into formation. The refugee transport, unarmed but fast, moved to shield civilian evacuation shuttles. What happened next wasn't a grand battle. It was messy, desperate, human. They didn't have fancy shields or energy lances. They used what they had. Old missile racks loaded with scrap metal shrapnel, jury-rigged EMP bursts from damaged reactors, and tactics born from years of losing and learning. One frigate flew straight into a swarm cluster, detonating its core at point-blank range, not to destroy but to scatter them. Another used its tractor beam to yank debris into the swarm's path, creating barriers out of broken cargo pods and shattered hull plates. On the station, the Admiral coordinated from a damaged control room, her voice hoarse but sharp. She directed human pilots to cover escape routes, not attack head-on. "Protect the civilians," she kept saying. "Just keep them safe. That's all we need to do." And they did. A young pilot, barely older than the girl back in the room, flew his fighter through a collapsing corridor, drawing swarm units away from a group of trapped children. He didn't make it out. His last transmission was calm. "Tell them, we kept our promise." Another engineer, stranded on a broken gantry, used her own body to seal a hull breach long enough for medics to pull survivors through. She died holding the emergency patch in place, her hands frozen around the edges. No one ordered them to do it. No medals were promised. They just did it because that's who they were. Inside the council chamber, the delegates watched the feeds in stunned silence. They saw humans throwing themselves between danger and strangers. They saw ships sacrificing themselves not for victory but for time, for lives they didn't even know. The silver-skinned delegate who'd called them reckless now stood motionless, eyes fixed on a feed showing a human frigate shielding a luminary shuttle with its own hull. The stone-faced Zenthar finally spoke. "This is not strategy. This is something else." The luminary representative glowed softly. "It's called care." Outside, the tide turned, not because the humans won, but because they held the line long enough for the Council's heavy defenses to activate. Reinforcements arrived. The swarm remnant was crushed, scattered, finally silenced. When it was over, the station was scarred. Smoke curled from vents. Debris floated in zero-G pockets. But the civilians were safe, and the human ships? They drifted, battered again, hulls smoking, power flickering, but they were still there. Medics boarding the Aegis found crew members sharing oxygen masks with injured alien dock workers. Found pilots giving their rations to scared children from other species. Found the Admiral, bleeding from a shrapnel wound in her arm, still coordinating rescue efforts over a cracked comms unit. Later, when the girl was finally allowed out of the room, She walked through the medical bay and saw something that made her stop. A human engineer, bandaged and exhausted, was carefully stitching up the torn wing of a small, bird-like alien child, using thread from her own uniform. The girl didn't cry, but for the first time in months she smiled. Back in the council chamber, no one spoke for a long time. The footage of the battle played on loop, not the explosions but the quiet moments. The shared oxygen, the shielded shuttles, the last words of the pilot. The Vraxian delegate finally stood. Not to speak, just to leave. Its offer of protection was dead. No one would believe it now. The luminary turned to the others. They didn't come here to take. They came to give, even when they had nothing left. And in that moment, something shifted in the heart of the galaxy. Not because humanity proved they were strong, but because they proved they were kind even in the dark. The blood on their ships wasn't just from war anymore. It was from sacrifice, and this time the galaxy saw it clearly. 3 days after the swarm attack, the air in the council chamber felt different, lighter somehow. Not because the danger was gone. Everyone knew the galaxy was still full of shadows, but because something new had taken root in the cracks of old suspicion. Hope, maybe, or at least the beginning of trust. The humans were called back not as petitioners but as witnesses. The girl walked in holding the smooth stone the maintenance drone had given her, her steps small but steady. The linguist no longer clutched her datapad like a shield. She carried it like a tool. And the admiral? She still wore her patched uniform, but she didn't stand like someone bracing for rejection. She stood like someone who'd already done what mattered. The council didn't open with questions this time. They opened with silence, and then, one by one, the delegates rose. Not all of them. But enough. The luminary glowed warmly. The Zenthar gave a slow, deliberate nod. Even the silver-skinned delegate who'd once called humans reckless simply said, "You held the line when we could not." That will not be forgotten. Then came the vote. It wasn't loud. No gavel slammed. No dramatic music swelled. Just a quiet ripple of light across the chamber floor. Green where approval passed, red where it didn't. When it settled, the green outnumbered the red by the narrowest of margins. Provisional membership. Not full status. Not yet, but a start. A door cracked open. A hush fell over the room. The girl looked up at the admiral, eyes wide. The linguist let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. And the admiral? She just closed her eyes for a second, long enough to feel the weight of billions of lost voices finally being heard. After the session, they were shown to their new space, a small chamber near the outer ring, plain but clean. No grand hall, no banners, just 4 walls, a table, a screen, and a window that looked out onto the stars. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The first human seat in the history of the galaxy. That evening, as the station's lights dimmed for rest cycle, the girl did something quiet, but powerful. From a sealed pouch in her coat, she pulled out a small dry bulb, wrapped in cloth, saved through fire, through flight, through fear. It was a flower, one of the last from Earth. A white lily, once common in gardens under open skies. She knelt by the window ledge where a tiny hydroponic tray had been left by kind hands. With careful fingers, she planted the bulb in the nutrient gel. Then she sat back, watching it like it might bloom right then and there. The linguist sat beside her. "Do you think it'll grow?" The girl didn't answer right away. Then softly, "It has to. Someone has to remember what Earth smelled like." The admiral stood behind them, arms crossed, but her shoulders were lower now, less burdened. She looked at the two of them, so young, so tired, so full of quiet courage, and thought of all the faces she'd lost. All the voices that would never speak again. But here, in this strange place far from home, something of them lived on. News of humanity's acceptance spread fast. Not just through official channels, but through whispers in cargo bays. Messages between pilots, stories told over shared meals in station cafes. Other species began stopping by the human chamber, not to inspect, but to talk. A young engineer from a methane-breathing world brought schematics for better air filters. A trader from the outer rim left a crate of preserved fruit from someone who remembers hunger. No names. No demands. Just kindness returned. It wasn't perfect. Some still watched from the shadows. Some still doubted. Rebuilding trust would take years, maybe generations. And Earth? Earth was still broken. Healing would take even longer. But for the first time, they weren't alone in trying. One night, the Admiral stood alone at the window watching a supply ship glide past, its lights blinking like distant fireflies. She thought about the war, the screams, the silence after, and then she thought about the pilot who gave his life to save strangers, the engineer who sealed a breach with her own body, the child who planted a flower in alien soil. They hadn't come here to conquer. They hadn't come to demand. They'd come because they believed deep down, even when everything was dark, that the universe might still have room for people who cared. And now, against all odds, it did. The next morning, the girl checked her flower. Still no bloom. But the gel was moist. The bulb was firm, and tiny white threads, roots, had begun to reach down into the new world. She smiled. Outside, the human ships still floated nearby, their hulls scarred, their engines quiet. But they weren't just war machines anymore. They were reminders. Proof that even after the worst, life could begin again. And in that small chamber with its plain walls and single window, humanity didn't just have a seat at the table. They had a chance to listen, to learn, to heal, and maybe one day to help others the way they'd been helped. The galaxy was vast. Cold in places, dangerous in others. But it wasn't empty. And now, finally, it wasn't silent either, because somewhere near the edge of a great ring-shaped station, a child watered a flower, a linguist practiced new words, and an admiral looked up at the stars, not with fear, but with quiet hope. They had arrived bloodied, but they stayed human. And that, more than anything, was what changed everything.